Have you ever seen a human being standing still, not resisting, and yet being handcuffed so tightly that their blood starts to spill? Have you ever wondered, what happens when a black woman dares to ask one simple question? Why are you stopping me? And you wouldn't believe it. Just that one question, a question any citizen has the right to ask, ended the careers of 3 police officers, triggered a federal investigation into an entire city, and forced America to look at itself in the mirror. But the most shocking part isn't the arrest. It's not the insults, the mocking laughter, or the handcuffs tightening until they drew blood. The most shocking part is that they had no idea who they were humiliating. A black woman, from the most stigmatized, impoverished neighborhood in the city. No makeup, no uniform, no entourage. Just an ordinary citizen driving home. But beneath her jacket, in the very moment they called her the kind of person who needs to be taught a lesson, she was carrying classified Defense Department communication gear because she was a 4-star general in the United States Marine Corps, and with just one press of a button, she made an entire police precinct tremble. She brought the military, the DOJ, the FBI, and even the governor's office storming in before dawn. What exactly happened that night? Why did multiple police leaders fall in just 43 minutes? What did that phone call trigger? And what horrifying truth about racism was exposed? One so severe it forced Congress to open a special hearing? You're about to witness one of the most breath-tightening, rage-inducing, tear-bringing true stories about an America many people are afraid to look at. If you care about justice, if you've ever felt powerless, if you want the truth exposed instead of buried, watch until the end of this story and subscribe to Racist Reality right now so you won't miss any journey uncovering injustice. Because every video here is a reminder that justice doesn't come on its own. We must take it back. Are you ready? Let's begin. The night wind drifted through the hallway of Brookdale Station, carrying with it a metallic chill and the thick, sterile scent of cleaning chemicals. The fluorescent light above flickered in uneven pulses, shining down on the pale gray tiles as if every color, every hope, had been drained out of this place. In the mugshot room, Maya Johnson stood motionless, her wrists pulled behind her back, steel cuffs tightened so harshly that thin lines of blood were beginning to seep through the metal. A red streak slid across her skin, then dripped to the floor. Yet her face remained calm, still as a surface of water right before a storm breaks. Officer Ryan Harris gripped her elbow, squeezing harder than necessary. He knew it hurt. He liked that it hurt. A tilted smirk crept across his face, cold and arrogant, like her pain was cheap entertainment. In the sterile, icy light, his voice rang out, not questioning, but declaring power. You picked the wrong day to show attitude to a cop. Each word dropped like a thorn. In front of them, Captain Mark Wilson, broad-shouldered, pot-bellied, eyes sharp like a dull knife, stood with his hands on his hips, staring at Maya with the familiarity of someone used to judging others. It had been a long time since he looked up at anyone. He was used to looking down, used to disciplining trouble types, as he called them. Talking back to an officer. You know what people like you usually end up with, right? He stepped closer, close enough that his breath, thick with coffee and anger, blew straight into Maya's face. People like you, he emphasized, always end up learning the hard way. People like you. The phrase slid past Maya's ears, sharp as a blade. She had heard those words her entire childhood in Eastwood Gardens, where being black, poor, and from the right neighborhood was reason enough to be suspected. But hearing it now in the clothes of an ordinary woman, without her uniform, without stars on her shoulders, she felt all the years of work, all the battles, the sacrifices, the scars, and the commendations vanish beneath their gaze of contempt. To them, she wasn't a 4-star general of the United States Marine Corps. She was just a black woman from that neighborhood. Wilson gestured, and Harris shoved Maya toward the wall, pressing her face against its freezing surface. Metal scraped against flesh, each small movement sending a line of pain shooting down her arm. But Maya didn't groan, didn't bow her head, didn't beg. She simply inhaled, spine straightening, letting them see that her silence was stronger than any scream. The mugshot camera flashed. In that instant, Maya's image appeared like an indictment. Shoulders square, eyes unwavering, wrists bleeding. A quiet, unmistakable dignity, something deeply human, not forged on a training field but born from a lifetime of being underestimated. The booking clerk asked for her name without even glancing up from the screen. Maya enunciated clearly, "Maya Johnson." When he typed in her address, his fingers froze mid-keystroke. Eastwood Gardens? His voice changed completely. A mix of disdain, suspicion, and pity tangled inside those two words, as if that address alone explained every crime she had never committed. Behind her, Wilson and Harris leaned against the water cooler, laughing loudly enough for her to hear. "Another one from Eastwood thinking they're special," Wilson said. Harris added, "This one even argues like a lawyer, thinks she's above the law." Their laughter echoed across the cramped room, not joyful, but like the sound of men who believe they have the right to hurt others. Maya didn't respond. Her eyes closed for a moment, not out of fear, but because she was memorizing everything, every word, every laugh, every wrinkle on Wilson's face, every number on Harris's badge. The memory was sharp as ammunition. Soon it would become evidence. When allowed to make her phone call, Maya didn't call her mother, her friends, or a lawyer. She walked to the wall-mounted phone, picked up the receiver with a hand still trembling from the tightness of the cuffs. Silence spread across the room. Wilson crossed his arms, waiting to see what she would do. Harris leaned back, half smirking, half sneering. Maya dialed a sequence of numbers. No one in the station recognized it. But when the other end picked up and the voice spoke, the room seemed to freeze. "Pentagon Operations Center, state your authorization." Maya straightened, her voice turning sharp, firm, and completely incongruent with the appearance of a cuffed detainee. "Authorization code, Delta 75 Alpha 4, initiate oversight protocol." There was a 2-second silence. Then the operator's tone shifted to one so solemn that even Wilson's brows drew together. "General Johnson, location confirmed, response team deploying, timeline 43 minutes. She placed the receiver down gently, as if she had just ordered a pizza, rather than summon the full weight of the United States Department of Defense onto a small-town police station. Just then, the door swung open. Councilman Richard Clark walked in wearing an expensive suit, polished shoes, and a gold ring gleaming under the lights. His gaze swept across Maya and curled into a smug smile. "Another one from Eastwood causing trouble," he said, as if she couldn't hear. "These people need to learn a lesson about compliance." Maya was pushed into a holding cell. The metal door clanged shut behind her. The only light trickled from the dim bulb overhead. She sat on the cold steel bench, her wrists throbbing, but her eyes calmly fixed on the clock on the wall. The minute hand pointed at the 17. She whispered almost inaudibly, 43 minutes left. And then, the entire city of Brookdale would have to answer. The last light of day slipped behind the worn buildings of Eastwood Gardens, leaving the sky washed in pale orange mingled with deep indigo, the color of evenings that seemed peaceful, yet always carried the quiet, familiar unease every black resident knew too well. The patched asphalt roads, the smell of backyard barbecue drifting through the wind, the laughter of children playing before true nightfall, everything felt tender, fragile, temporary. Maya drove her mother's old sedan, the back seat still scented with hair pomade and the sweet pastries her mother liked to bake and share with neighbors. She planned to swing through Brookdale Hills to pick up a few things. Not because the items were better there, but because her mother liked a particular tea sold only in that wealthy neighborhood. The road between the two communities was an invisible border. On one side, leaking roofs, muddy front yards, abandoned shopping carts left on sidewalks. On the other hand, smooth black asphalt, non-slip sidewalks, decorative street lamps, and neatly trimmed trees. Just a few more meters, and the world shifted colors, from the dull brown-gray of struggle to the sterile, curated brightness of privilege. But Maya didn't make it to the border. Ahead, a flash of light cut across the road, the kind of light anyone raised in Eastwood learned to recognize instantly. The blue and red glare of police cruisers. Checkpoint. 6 cruisers stretched across the street, blocking both lanes. 3 traffic cones stood before them, followed by a white plastic barrier stamped with the word police. Floodlights blasted straight into drivers' faces, turning the officers into silhouettes, taller, more powerful, and impossible to read. You couldn't tell if they were irritated tonight. You could only hope they weren't. Maya slowed, rolled down her window, and placed both hands on the wheel exactly how she'd been taught at 13. Don't make sudden movements. Don't react fast. Don't say anything that can be twisted. Become smaller. Her mother had repeated it endlessly. Even though Maya commanded thousands of Marines, had stood on battlefields, had made life-or-death decisions. But here, between Eastwood and Brookdale, none of that mattered. None of it shielded her from becoming a footnote in a police report, if they chose so. Officer Ryan Harris stepped forward first, flashlight in hand. He shone it directly into Maya's face before saying a single word. The sharp LED beam stung her eyes, but she didn't flinch. She waited until he lowered it slightly, still aimed at her, just no longer trying to blind her. "Documents," Harris said, his voice clipped, as if addressing a suspect about to be detained rather than a compliant driver. Maya handed over her license and registration. Harris glanced at the address. Eastwood Gardens, Building 14. A smirk bloomed, the kind all black people recognized instantly, not amusement, contempt. "Eastwood Gardens," he repeated, loud enough for the nearby officer to hear. Into his shoulder radio, he spoke briskly, "Need additional verification. Eastwood resident at the checkpoint." In the cruiser, 2 officers looked up. One let out a low whistle. Another shook his head and chuckled. Maya saw everything in the rearview mirror. They didn't bother to hide their disdain, because on this stretch of road, at this hour, who would defend a black woman in an old car? "Officer, may I ask?" Maya began, her tone respectful. Instantly, Harris snapped, "No questions." He leaned in, voice low and barbed. "Don't try to lawyer up on me. Questions make things worse for you." Not a new line. It was the same warning she'd heard as a girl in Eastwood. Don't talk back. Don't ask why. Don't make them feel challenged. In this neighborhood, it wasn't advice. It was survival. Captain Mark Wilson stepped out of the command car. His uniform strained across his stomach, the cap pulled low, sharpening the harshness in his eyes. He didn't look at Maya like a driver waiting for her turn. He looked at her like a walking problem. Every step he took pressed a weight into the air. "Out of the car," Wilson ordered, offering no explanation. "Now." Maya kept her voice calm. "I have the right to know the reason, officer." Wilson tilted his head as if studying some strange animal trying to speak. "You were told to get out. That's reason enough." "My license is valid," Maya said, not arguing, just stating. "And this checkpoint—" "You resisting?" Wilson barked. "Or you think being from Eastwood means the law doesn't apply to you?" Harris laughed. Another officer nudged his partner, muttering something about Eastwood folks thinking they're special. Maya opened the door and stepped out with her posture straight, hands visible, movements she'd practiced her entire life. She didn't look at Wilson defiantly, but with the steady awareness of someone who understood the lethal combination of male ego, authority, and racial bias. Wilson circled behind her car, peeked into the trunk, then turned to Maya. "Enhanced search protocol," he declared, as if reciting federal statute. Maya knew the rules. They needed reasonable suspicion, evidence, or signs of wrongdoing. But he didn't need any of that. Her address was enough. "I do not consent to a search without probable cause," Maya said clearly, her tone soft but firm. Harris shrugged. "Oh, she knows the law." "Laws are for people who follow them," Wilson said. "People like you don't fall in that category." "People like you." Again. Maya replied steadily. "The Fourth Amendment protects me from unreasonable search, and—" "Look at that," Harris snickered, stepping closer. "She's gonna lecture us." In the next lane, a white family was waved through immediately after showing their license. Maya watched the mother glance over, confused but relieved when their car was signaled to continue. Maya wondered if they knew that just behind them, a black woman was being treated like a criminal without having done a single thing wrong. "Clear the line," Wilson ordered. "Do you consent to a vehicle search?" he asked, not to hear her answer, but to record her refusal. "I do not consent," Maya repeated. "That's obstruction," Harris said instantly. "Arrest her." Harris grabbed Maya's arm, twisting it behind her back hard enough for her to hear a crack in her shoulder joint. She shifted her weight to avoid dislocation. The cuffs clamped shut, metal slicing into her skin. Pain flared through her arm, but her voice remained even. "I am not resisting. I am cooperating." "Shut up," Harris snarled. "Camera's broken. Don't bother." Maya looked directly at the body cam that had just been switched off. The tiny red light blinked out. No recording, no witnesses, just them and her. But they didn't know one thing. The watch on her wrist, ordinary on the outside, had automatically activated audio recording and GPS transmission the moment she used the emergency pre-activation command. Every word, every action, every order, they were all being sent exactly where they needed to go. Wilson stood in front of her as Harris dragged her toward the cruiser. "Who do you think you are talking law to us? You're nothing special." Maya looked at him, not with anger, not with hatred, but with a calm so deep it unsettled. "You'll find out soon enough," she said softly. "Not a chance," Wilson scoffed. Harris shoved her head down into the cruiser, harder than necessary. The metal door frame hit her forehead, sharp, cold. The door slammed shut, a final punctuation mark to one chapter, and the first crack of thunder for the reversal no one in Brookdale could imagine. As the cruiser began to roll forward, Maya glanced out the window and saw a young woman in a white sedan trying to discreetly record the arrest on her phone. Their eyes met. Maya gave her a subtle nod, a quiet acknowledgement. "I see you. Thank you." The cruiser pulled away from the checkpoint, swallowed by the night. Outside, officers continued waving white drivers through, while 3 cars from Eastwood were detained for extended inspection. A two-tier world, visible to everyone, spoken by none. No one except Maya tonight had the ability to make the system answer. She leaned back, breathing slowly. Her wrists still throbbed, but she wouldn't let the pain direct her. She closed her eyes for a second, then opened them, staring straight ahead. And at that moment, her watch gave a single subtle vibration, the signal that all data had been sent. The storm had begun, and Brookdale Hills had no idea. Brookdale Station at night always carried a very particular smell. The smell of leftover cold coffee from the previous shift, the dusty scent of old paperwork, the rubber odor from police boots that had pounded through the hallways thousands of times a day, and especially the icy sting of disinfectant spreading everywhere like a thin mist, silently reminding everyone, this is not a place to look for warmth or mercy. When the metal door opened and Harris dragged Maya inside, no one in the room asked why she was handcuffed, why blood was sliding down her hands, why her gaze didn't waver. They just looked, then turned away, as if this scene happened too often to be worth caring about. The interrogation room sat at the end of the hallway, past 3 glass panels and a heavy steel door. Harsh white light from the ceiling reflected off the stainless steel table, scratched and scarred by time and by the countless interrogations that had taken place there. The metal chair was so cold Maya could feel the chill cutting through her thin layer of clothing when they pushed her down into it. Wilson stood across from her, took off his cap, and rubbed his face as if this shift bored him. But when he looked up, his suspicious, predatory eyes gleamed, those of a man convinced that his authority allowed him to crush anyone in this room. "Do you know why you're here?" Wilson opened, his low voice packed with challenge. Maya looked up calmly, her voice soft but clear. "I requested to speak with a lawyer." "And you will," Wilson replied, "when we're done." He emphasized "we," as if the law were something elastic that bent to his will, not a fixed principle meant to protect every citizen. Harris stood behind Maya with his hands in his pockets, rocking his weight from one foot to the other like someone waiting for a show. He stared at her injured wrists and sneered. Never seen someone from Eastwood know so much about Miranda rights. Usually they just scream and resist. Maya turned slightly, just enough to look his way. "I know my rights, because I've taught them to the soldiers under my command." Wilson laughed. "Soldiers? You?" He tilted his head a bit, as if trying to read her face more clearly under the harsh light, searching for some sign that she could be telling the truth. "Let me guess. You're a sergeant? Or not even that? Don't tell me you actually expect me to believe that ID you handed us is real?" The ID, the card of a 4-star general, lay on the table between them like a meaningless prop. Wilson picked it up with 2 fingers, turning it back and forth as if examining a cheap fake. He snorted, then slapped it back down on the table hard enough that it slid a few centimeters. "You really think we're that easy to fool?" Wilson growled. "A black woman from Eastwood Gardens, a place where more than half the young men have criminal records, hands me this and claims she's a general in the United States military?" Harris chimed in, dripping sarcasm. "If she's a real general, I'm the president." Maya looked down at the ID on the table. No one in the room noticed the brief flicker of hurt in her eyes. Not the hurt of being called a fraud, but the pain of knowing that no matter how many achievements, stars or honors she carried, her skin color and her address still dictated how they saw her. Not by what she had done, but by where she came from. But she didn't let that into her voice. "That ID is completely accurate." "Of course it is," Wilson scoffed. "You want to add impersonating a military officer to your charges? You're on the right track." Before Maya could say more, the door banged open, and Detective Daniel Ruiz walked in. He wore a white shirt and a dark blue vest, sleeves slightly rolled, hair trimmed neat, and his eyes, unlike the others, held a measured awareness, skepticism, and a hint of caution. "I thought we were just questioning her," Ruiz said, glancing at Maya before shifting his gaze to the 2 officers. "Why is she cuffed like that?" Harris answered for them. "Safety, Detective. She's a little difficult." He said it like Maya was a threat, not a woman sitting straight with blood soaking into her wrists. Ruiz didn't respond to Harris. His eyes dropped to the ID on the table. Unlike Wilson, he didn't laugh, didn't jerk his chin, didn't show contempt. He reached out, picked up the card, turned it under the light, then pulled a small UV flashlight from his pocket. "What the hell are you doing?" Wilson asked, irritation creeping into his tone. "Checking," Ruiz replied simply. The UV light passed over the surface of the ID. Security features, microprint, watermarks, embossed seals, appeared exactly as they should. Ruiz was silent for a moment. He lowered the light and looked straight at Maya. "This ID," Ruiz said slowly, "it's real." The words hit the room like a stone thrown into still water. Harris blinked. Wilson's face tightened, as if his mind refused to accept what he'd just heard. "No way," Wilson snapped. "She's scamming us." "No," Ruiz said, firmer this time. "I served in the military before I joined the force. I know what a real ID looks like. This is a 4-star general's credentials. That's the highest rank in the Marine Corps. You don't fake that easily." Harris stepped closer, peered at the card, then looked back at Wilson. "Real? Like, actually real?" Ruiz didn't take his eyes off Maya as he spoke. "State your name and current position." "Maya Johnson," she replied. "United States Marine Corps. General." Ruiz straightened a little. Military reflex, old discipline rising in his blood, made him unconsciously compose himself before someone outranking him, even if she wasn't in uniform, even if she was cuffed, even if she was sitting in a small-town police station. "We need to verify this immediately," Ruiz said. Wilson folded his arms, rubbed his jaw, his voice thick with annoyance. "I told you. She's impersonating. He didn't finish. The desk phone in the corner of the room started ringing. The sound was sharp, urgent, like metal scraping glass. Instinctively, everyone looked over. Ruiz walked to it and picked up the receiver. "Brookdale Station, Detective Ruiz speaking." A brief silence. Then Ruiz said, "Yes, she's here." The steadiness in his voice began to fade. "Yes, I'll inform them immediately." He gently set the receiver back down, turned to Wilson, and said, "That was the Department of Defense." The small room suddenly felt suffocating. It took Wilson a few seconds to process, then he jerked his head once, like someone who'd just been struck. Harris sank into a chair, head bowed, face visibly pale. Ruiz continued. "They asked, 'Is General Johnson safe?' And they want to know why she's being held without legal counsel." Wilson swallowed, his voice cracking. "That doesn't make sense. Who called?" "Pentagon Operations Center," Ruiz replied. "The duty officer, and they sounded not pleased." Harris whispered, "We're so screwed." Wilson snapped his head toward Maya, as if seeing her for the first time. Fear and anger mixed in his eyes. But Maya still sat there, hands cuffed, dried blood on her wrists, face as calm as water before a storm. You called the Pentagon?" Wilson asked, his voice slightly shaking. Maya tilted her head, answering in a low, steady tone that seemed to drop the room's temperature a few degrees. "I called exactly where I was supposed to call." Harris took a step back, as if being near her for one more second was too dangerous. Wilson turned away, kicking a chair so hard it slammed against the wall. "What the hell do you think you're doing? You trying to bring this whole station down with you?" "No," Maya replied, her eyes locked on him. "You did that yourselves." Wilson clenched his jaw as if struggling to spit out another retort, but Ruiz spoke first. "Captain," Ruiz said, his voice even and sharp as a blade. "If the person we're unlawfully detaining is an active 4-star general, we've already violated several federal statutes. And if we keep questioning her after she's asked for a lawyer, the list gets even longer." Wilson turned to Ruiz, voice rough. "You don't understand what's going on here." "Oh, I understand perfectly," Ruiz replied. "I understand why she was stopped at the checkpoint, why she was asked those questions, and why she's cuffed in here right now. And I understand that if her chain of command is already calling from D.C., we're out of time to pretend this is just a misunderstanding." Just then, there was a knock at the door. A young officer stood outside, face pale. "Captain, dispatch says we've got multiple urgent calls from Washington, and I think the governor's office as well." Wilson tried to steady his voice, but failed. "Tell them we'll call back." "Sir," the young officer swallowed. "They said, no, we'll hold." Harris looked at Wilson, then at Maya, then back at Wilson. "Captain, what do we do?" Maya slowly raised her eyes, not smiling, not mocking, just speaking a single simple sentence, one that made the room feel as heavy as lead. "This is only the first step. There are still 40 minutes left." Silence swallowed the room. No one laughed. No one sneered. No one looked at Maya like someone to overpower. Because in that moment, they understood. The woman they'd cuffed wasn't another Eastwood troublemaker. She was the storm about to break over their heads, and none of them had enough authority to outrun it. The hallway of Brookdale Station at 10 p.m. was usually empty, filled only with the soft whine of an old ventilation fan and the flickering of uneven lights spilling onto the faded tile floor. But tonight, every breath of air seemed thicker, heavier, dense with a tension no one in the station dared to name. It slipped into lungs, into hearts, into every movement of everyone inside the building, making them swallow hard without knowing exactly why. Wilson paced back and forth in the interrogation room, one hand gripping his hip, the other clenched so tightly around something in his pocket that his knuckles turned white. Maya sat again on the metal chair, her back not resting against it, yet straight as a steel column, her eyes calmly observing each man, bigger, more powerful, who was beginning to tremble before the very thing they themselves had unleashed. "You've started something bigger than you realize," Wilson said, his voice rough, as if he were desperately trying to salvage the authority slipping out of his grasp. But his voice no longer sounded certain. It shook, just slightly, but enough for Maya to hear it clearly. She remained silent. Maya's silence was not submission. It was the kind of silence that forced the other side to look at themselves, the kind that made Wilson turn away, because he couldn't stand to see the eyes of the woman he had dismissed as trash just minutes ago, now looking straight through him, as if he were the small one. Harris stood near the door, shoulders tight, his eyes going to the wall clock more often than to Maya. "Captain," he said quietly, "if that really was someone from the Pentagon calling, then—" "Not your concern," Wilson snapped, but the outburst was weak, like the wheezing bark of a dog that thinks it's more dangerous than it really is. Ruiz stood with his arms folded against the wall, his gaze fixed on Maya. He said nothing, but he was the only one in the room whose composure hadn't collapsed. His eyes held no judgment, no fear, something closer to respect, though he was trying to hide it. And somehow, Maya sensed it. A small flicker of hope sparked in the room, just enough to crack the suffocating despair creeping into the minds of the others. Then suddenly, the floor began to tremble. Not violently, just a low, distant thud from outside, like the heavy sound of large doors thrown open, followed by the rhythmic pounding of many synchronized footsteps, hitting the ground like stones dropping into water. Anyone who had ever lived near a military base would recognize that sound instantly. The footsteps of military police taking position. Wilson whipped around. "What the hell is that?" A young officer rushed to the door of the interrogation room, panting like he'd run the length of the hallway. "Sir, you should probably come out and see this." Harris stepped out first, and his face went pale in an instant. Wilson followed, heavy-footed, as if he were carrying a boulder on his back. Ruiz walked out last, unhurried, but his eyes brightened. The brightness of someone who understood that justice had finally found its way into this building. When they stepped out of the hallway, the sight before them made them all freeze. 3 black SUVs, large, new, matte-finished with subtle military insignia, were parked right in front of the station. Their headlights were still on, cold white beams washing over the facade of Brookdale Station, drawing a brutal contrast between the sleek efficiency of the military and the worn, almost shabby look of the local police building. The doors of the vehicles opened all at once. A military police unit stepped out, 12 of them, uniforms immaculate, wearing body armor, badges catching the light, every step firm and controlled, making the ground seem to hum under their feet. It wasn't the swaggering walk of Brookdale cops. This was the stride of people trained to handle national-level crises. At the head of the formation was a tall, powerfully built black man with close-cropped hair, a stern face, and sharp eyes. A silver eagle insignia gleamed on his chest. Colonel Isaac Jackson. Anyone in law enforcement knew the name. The Department of Defense called him when things were serious enough that mistakes were no longer an option. The desk sergeant at Brookdale Station stood at the entrance, his hands shaking so badly he nearly dropped the duty log. "Sir, we're not sure who called you here." Colonel Jackson didn't respond. He just looked at the sergeant, and his gaze was so cold that the man instinctively stepped aside. Jackson walked in without waiting for permission. The military police spread into two lines, flanking the hallway, turning the passage into something that looked more like an approach to a military tribunal than a small-town police station. Wilson summoned what courage he had left and stepped forward. I'm Captain Mark Wilson, commanding officer here. Can you tell me the purpose?" Jackson didn't so much as slow down. He walked past Wilson as if he didn't exist, like a strong wind blowing him out of the way. As he passed, Jackson spoke one short sentence. "We're here to address the serious violations committed in this facility." Wilson's mouth opened to respond, but Jackson was already past him, his eyes locked on the interrogation room door where Maya was sitting. "General," Jackson said as he stepped into the room. The two syllables sliced through the air like an arrow, tearing the tension apart with a single, undeniable truth. Wilson spun around so fast he nearly stumbled into the table. Harris stood frozen. The clerk on duty forgot to breathe, and Ruiz, for the first time since the crisis began, let out a long breath, as if laying down a weight he'd been carrying. Maya lifted her head, her gaze neither arrogant nor triumphant, but that of someone seeing a comrade again after years in uniform, quiet, deep, and full of trust. Colonel Jackson stood straight and saluted her with full military protocol. "Ma'am." Maya returned the salute with solemn precision. "Colonel." That exchange was a slap across the face of the entire Brookdale system, not with a hand, but with the truth. The woman they had cuffed, beaten, and dismissed as some troublemaker from the projects was one of the highest-ranking officers in the entire United States military. Jackson turned to Wilson, his voice low and razor-sharp. "No wonder the Pentagon called us in the middle of the night. A 4-star general is being unlawfully detained. Anything else you'd like to add?" Wilson stammered like a child caught in the act. We didn't know. We thought her ID." "She," Jackson corrected immediately, not raising his voice, but enough to make Wilson flinch. "General Johnson is not her to you. She is my superior officer, and she has just been insulted, assaulted, and stripped of her legal rights by people who claim to represent the law in this jurisdiction." Ruiz stepped forward and spoke quietly to Jackson. "Sir, I checked the ID and verified it was real." Jackson nodded, his expression softening just enough to show respect. Respect he hadn't shown anyone else in this building. "Handcuffs," Jackson said, his tone shifting into command. "Remove them." Harris fumbled for the key, his hands shaking so badly he almost dropped it. Ruiz stepped in, gently took the key from him, and unlocked Maya's cuffs with a clean, decisive movement. When the cuffs snapped open, the clink of metal rang through the room like the sound of freedom being restored. Maya brought her hands together and rubbed her wrists. The skin was still smeared with blood. Jackson saw it, and his eyes darkened like a storm rolling in. "Who did this?" he asked, his voice low but so cold it could have been made of needles. No one answered. Harris stared at the floor. Wilson's eyes went to the wall, pretending not to hear. Jackson didn't need their words. "Fine," he said. "We'll review the footage. including the footage from the military-issued watch you had no idea she was wearing. That sentence nearly brought Harris to his knees. Jackson stepped closer to Maya. "Ma'am, we deployed the full response team under Protocol Delta. From the moment you activated the signal, the entire process was monitored. The Pentagon, DOJ, and the governor's office have all been notified. Everything has been recorded." Maya nodded slightly. "I know." Wilson blurted out weakly. "General, why do this? You could have just told us from the start that you were a general and—" Maya turned to him, her eyes as sharp as a thin blade. "If I had used my rank immediately to protect myself, what would you have learned? Do you think ordinary citizens, the ones you treat like garbage, have rank they can use?" That sentence was a knife driven straight into the heart of the system Wilson represented. He had no answer. Jackson stepped forward again, his voice returning to an icy command. "We will be temporarily taking control of this entire station until the federal investigative team arrives. All servers, cameras, documents, and personnel will be reviewed. Anyone involved in the unlawful detention will be held for questioning." Ruiz straightened, almost as if falling into military formation, even though he still wore his civilian vest. Jackson looked around, then said, "General, this building is no longer a safe place for you to remain. Please come to the conference room. We've set it up as a temporary command center." Maya stood. She paused briefly when her arm protested with pain, but Jackson immediately supported her elbow, lightly, not because she was weak, but because someone like her deserved a level of respect Brookdale Station had never known how to offer to anyone with her skin color. They stepped into the hallway. The two lines of military police snapped to attention, saluting as Maya passed. Each strike of their heels echoed like drums calling an army, and the atmosphere of the entire station shifted in an instant. Brookdale officers pressed themselves against the walls, avoiding her gaze like children caught stealing candy. But no one spoke. No one dared call her she like that anymore. No one dared lean on the hollow shield of authority they'd once clung to. Harris avoided her eyes as she walked by. For a flicker of a second, something surfaced in his expression. Fear. Not fear of her rank, but the dawning realization that what he'd done to her wasn't just violence. It was a crime. Wilson stood flattened against the wall, his hands trembling so badly he had to tense his shoulders just to stay upright. His eyes stayed glued to the floor, unable to look up at the person he had called people like you just hours earlier. As Maya passed them, she didn't need to raise her voice, didn't need to lash out, didn't need revenge. Her gaze alone was a verdict. Jackson led her into the conference room, now converted into a command center. Military laptops sat open, a large screen displaying a map of the checkpoint, data files and live feeds from military drones sweeping over the Brookdale area. 10 service members were working at high speed in the cramped room. The air hummed with the scent of new electronics, the rapid tapping of keys, and that distinct atmosphere found only in strategy rooms, the feeling that justice was being assembled minute by minute. Maya took the chair at the center of the table. Jackson stood beside her, as formal and protective as if he were guarding a head of state. Ruiz slipped in last, hesitant. But Maya met his eyes and gave a small nod. He understood she was inviting him to be part of this. And when the conference room door closed, the energy inside shifted from chaos to laser focus. "Maya," Jackson said, using her name for the first time instead of her title. "Let's get started." She nodded, placed both hands on the table, sat up straight, her gaze sharp as a blade. "All right," Maya said. "Let's begin. They thought they could stop me because I'm a black woman from Eastwood Gardens." Her voice dropped, heavy with pain, but shining like red-hot metal. "So tonight, we're going to show them what happens when they lay their hands on someone like me." Outside, Brookdale Station trembled again. New footsteps were entering, the federal investigative team had arrived, and from that moment on, the game no longer belonged to Brookdale. It belonged to justice. The air in the makeshift conference room at Brookdale Station grew thicker as the night pushed toward the small hours. Outside, the sky had turned that deep blue that only appears when the city finally starts to quiet, but inside the room, everything was just beginning. The large screen on the wall displayed the Department of Defense logo. Next to it, smaller windows showed maps, charts, and lists of names. Military laptops sat on the table, cables running from them into the station's server system. Harsh neon light shone down on the faces of those seated around the table, tired, tense, but sharply alert. Maya sat at the center, back still straight, hands loosely clasped on the table. Her wrists had been roughly bandaged, the white gauze only making the injury more stark. Every time someone's eyes passed over it, a quiet sense of guilt rose in their chest, especially among those who had once worn Brookdale's blue uniform. Colonel Jackson stood beside her, tablet in hand, occasionally leaning over to exchange quick updates with the technical team working at the computers. An FBI agent in a black suit, badge gleaming, sat in the corner of the table, focused on the data streaming down his screen. The DOJ representative, a brown-skinned woman with her hair in a high bun and eyes sharp as a blade, scribbled swiftly into her notebook. The door opened. Two military police escorted Councilman Richard Clark, Captain Wilson, and Officer Harris into the room. There were no more heavy, authoritative footsteps. They walked as people summoned to a court, not handcuffed, but with an invisible rope of truth tightening slowly around their necks. "Sit," the DOJ representative said. Her voice was not icy, but it was far from friendly. "Tonight we're going to talk about what has really been happening in Brookdale for the past 6 months. Clark tried to hold on to his practiced political smile, the one that had helped him win multiple terms. But tonight, that smile looked thin and brittle, like paint stretched over a rotting wall. He pulled out a chair, adjusted his tie, and glanced at Maya as if trying to gauge what card she was about to play. Maya didn't look at him. Her eyes stayed on the large screen in front of her. A map of Brookdale appeared. The winding streets, residential areas, and the boundary between Eastwood Gardens and Brookdale Hills shaded in 2 different colors. Small red dots began to appear on the screen. 12 checkpoints, a military technician said, his voice precise. All active between February and August of 2025. The red dots clustered thickly along the edge of Eastwood Gardens, like a tightening noose. On the Brookdale Hills side, the wealthy neighborhood of big houses and manicured lawns, the map remained blank. Maya spoke, her voice low but clear. If this were a citywide security program, these red dots would be spread evenly. But they're not. Every checkpoint ringed the paths black residents have to take every day to get to work, the hospital, the school. Clark shrugged, trying to appear unmoved. The checkpoints were placed where crime rates are higher. That's data, not racism. The DOJ representative tilted her head and signaled to the tech team. Another chart appeared. Traffic violations by area. "These are from the Department of Transportation, not the police," she said. "Infractions like running red lights, speeding, failing to signal, are evenly distributed across both Eastwood and Brookdale Hills." But the screen shifted again, this time to a table of stats on stops and searches at the checkpoints. Bars of red and blue rose like a wall. 1. Traffic stops. 82% involved drivers of color from Eastwood. 2. Ordered out-of-vehicle and searches. 89% of drivers of color. 3 arrests following stops, 94% black. Her pen stopped moving. She looked up at Clark. "What would you like to call this, if not systemic racial discrimination?" Clark kept the smile, but the corners of his mouth flickered. "We're simply focusing on where the problems are. People from Eastwood tend to show more suspicious behavior." Suspicious because they're black? Maya asked, her voice dropping. The room fell silent for a few seconds. Or suspicious because they're poor enough that they can't afford good lawyers to fight back. Wilson shifted in his chair, sweat beginning to bead on his forehead. Harris stared down at the table like he wanted to disappear into it. And the outcome? Maya went on. They lose their jobs because of marks on their record, their kids watch them being handcuffed in front of the school gates, and they start to fear the sight of a patrol car even when they've done nothing wrong. They wake up earlier to take detours to avoid checkpoints, show up late to work, and then get fired. And after that, you say their neighborhood has more problems. An FBI analyst clicked his mouse. The screen switched to footage from checkpoint cameras. The video fast-forwarded, then froze on a familiar scene. An old sedan, a black driver, 2 children in the back seat. Officers ordered the driver out, searching every inch of the vehicle, hands resting on their holsters. The little girl in the back hugged a stuffed bear, eyes wide, lips trembling. This scenario occurs 37 times in 6 months, the agent said. Same pattern. Car from Eastwood, no clear violation, held, searched, threatened, then released without citation. If security is truly the goal, why aren't we seeing actual criminal arrests come from these stops? Maya looked at the image of the girl clutching her bear, her chest tightening. She saw herself at 10 years old again, sitting in the back of her mother's old car, watching officers tear through their vehicle just because of the wary look in their eyes when her mother passed by. She had seen that exact fear in countless children's eyes across America, and here it had been systematized into a program. Now for the more interesting part, the DOJ representative said, her tone cooling. Listen carefully. Audio played from the speakers. The first voice was unmistakable, Wilson. Want to see more arrests coming out of Eastwood? Clark called me directly, said the checkpoint program needs results. Got it? Don't waste time on the housewives in Brookdale Hills. Eastwood is where it's efficient. Soft chuckles from a few other officers echoed in the background. Harris chimed in. If you don't get anything, just check taillights, signals, paperwork. You'll find something. Numbers are what matter, right? The recording stopped. No one said anything for several seconds. The hum of the air conditioner was louder than any human voice. Clark swallowed, trying to push back. Isolated clips can't... The DOJ representative raised a hand. Another clip played. This time, it was Clark's voice. Not in a council chamber, but in a private meeting, recorded by the device Maya had been carrying. What we say to the press is public safety, Clark said, every word painfully clear. What we're really protecting is property values and cash flow. Brookdale Hills has to feel safe in the eyes of investors. Eastwood can take a bit of sacrifice. What about the people there? A male voice asked. They should be grateful, Clark replied. The less they show up on this side of town, the more orderly things stay. The air in the conference room seemed to solidify. There are things that, when repeated secondhand, people can still doubt. But when you hear them in the person's own voice, so confident, so cold, there is no space left for denial. Maya looked at Clark. Her eyes did not blaze with rage. Instead, they carried a deep, bottomless disappointment. You call that order, she said. I call it a border, drawn in blood and tears. A few chairs away, Ruiz sat with his hands clasped tightly together, his nails digging into his skin. He remembered patrolling through Eastwood, seeing the checkpoints in operation, wanting at times to say something, but staying silent. He had filed internal reports. They'd been buried. He had tried. But seeing the numbers now, he knew he had not tried hard enough. We also have these, one technician said, plugging Ruiz's USB drive into the system. Internal data Detective Ruiz collected. Emails appeared on the screen, line by line, day by day. Focus Eastwood. Go light on Brookdale. Prioritize holding vehicles registered in Sector G. Ensure arrest rate out of Eastwood doesn't fall below X% monthly. Then came the complaints. Scans of handwritten letters. I was stopped with no reason. My child cried all night because he's now scared of the police. They laughed when I asked why only our car was held. Above each letter was a stamp. Resolved. Beside it, a small note. No misconduct found. Out of over 100 complaints, the DOJ representative said, her voice catching just slightly. Not a single one was formally investigated. All were labeled unsubstantiated. But the camera, audio, and data we've seen tonight say the opposite. Maya stared at those letters, her vision blurring for a moment. Not from exhaustion, but because she saw in them voices that had been cut off, stories buried alive, people who had believed in the system one last time, and were betrayed. That's why I was at that checkpoint tonight, she said softly but clearly. Not to use my rank to slip out of trouble, but to prove that, if the system treats a 4-star general like a criminal just because she's a black woman from Eastwood, then this isn't a few bad apples. It is a ruthless machine, running exactly as designed. Clark leaned back in his chair as the last traces of his smile fell away. You're turning this into a racial issue, he said bitterly. We were just trying to keep the rest of the city safe. Which part? Maya asked, her gaze suddenly as cold as steel. The part where the houses cost more? The part with fewer black residents? The part your investors actually care about? The DOJ representative closed her notebook. I don't think we need to hear any more. She looked toward the FBI side. Based on the evidence collected, visual, audio, documentary, we have sufficient grounds for charges including systemic civil rights violations, unlawful detention, abuse of authority, and... She nodded toward the emails about development projects. Conspiracy to use state power to clear the way for private financial interests. The FBI agent stood, reading from the document in his hand. Edward Clark, councilman of the city of Brookdale. You are under federal investigation for civil rights violations, abuse of power, and colluding with private entities to implement a racially discriminatory checkpoint program. Captain Mark Wilson. Officer Ryan Harris and several other officers involved in this system will be detained for separate questioning. As of this moment, he looked directly at Clark. You are not permitted to leave this building without the express authorization of the federal investigative team. Clark jolted to his feet, voice rising, nearly shouting, This is a witch hunt. You're blowing one incident out of proportion. Maya stood too. The first time that night she raised her voice. She didn't yell, but her words cut clean through his. One incident? Hundreds of traffic stops. Hundreds of people are treated as suspicious because of where they live. Hundreds of children sit silently in the back seat, holding their breath every time they see blue and red lights. That's one incident to you? She pointed at the screen, where the map of Brookdale still glowed, red dots encircling Eastwood like open wounds. For you, this is a strategy. For them, it's a recurring nightmare. Any night could have been their last. No one answered. The FBI agent continued. From this point forward, you will remain under supervision. Your communications, movements, and access to city systems will be restricted pending further action. Ruiz watched the scene unfold, and part of him wanted to feel satisfied. But a larger part of him only felt a deep, hollow sadness. Because to reach this moment, so many had already paid the price. In sleepless nights, lost opportunities, humiliations endured with no idea who to turn to. When the session paused to allow the legal teams to prepare the next steps, Maya stepped out of the conference room and leaned lightly against the railing in the corridor. Outside, dawn was approaching. The sky above Eastwood Gardens was beginning to pale with the first strokes of morning. The old rooftops were still there. The people in those apartments still had no idea that tonight, in a police station on the other side of that boundary, the wheels of justice had finally begun to turn. Ruiz stepped out to stand beside her, silent for a few seconds before he spoke. "I should have done more earlier," he said, his voice low, offering no excuse. Maya kept her eyes forward. "You did what many others didn't dare to do, and tonight you stood on the right side. But for the past 6 months," Ruiz swallowed, "a lot of people got hurt." "Yes," Maya said, "and no investigation, no conviction will erase that. But we can stop others from going through the same thing. That's more than just standing aside and saying, 'There was nothing I could do.'" He fell silent, then asked, as if seeking confirmation, "This is just the beginning, isn't it?" Maya looked toward the horizon, where the first light of day was slowly spilling across the sky. "Yes," she said, "tonight is just the first night they've had to face what they've done. There will be hearings in Congress, court cases, and other cities looking at Brookdale and realizing they have the same red dots on their own maps." She squeezed the bandage on her wrist, feeling the familiar stab of pain. "And somewhere in Eastwood," Maya added quietly, "a child will wake up this morning and walk down the street without having to take a detour to avoid a checkpoint. For me, that alone makes this entire night worth it." Below, headlights began to appear on the roads. Brookdale was waking up, unaware that it had just stepped into a very different kind of morning. A morning when many who thought they could hide forever behind the sign that read "Public Safety" would have to answer the simplest question the Constitution has asked for generations. How do you treat the people who have less power than you? And tonight, Brookdale's answer had been recorded, more clearly than any signature on paper. The white glare of dozens of TV cameras reflected off the long wooden table, its polished surface gleaming as if it had just been refinished. The entire congressional hearing room, with its high ceiling, deep red velvet curtains, and vaulted dome engraved with old words, radiated such solemnity that even breathing felt heavy. The lawmakers sat in rows, their microphones lit, thick folders stacked in front of each of them and marked with colored tabs. 6 months of investigation, 43 minutes of intervention, and a lifetime of injustice condensed into a single room. General Maya Johnson entered through the rear door. She wore a full dress uniform, jacket perfectly pressed, 4 stars gleaming on her shoulders, ribbons lined the left side of her chest, each one a story. But today, no star. No ribbon weighed as much as the bruises on her wrists. Even though makeup had been applied to cover them, the marks still caught the light. Everyone in the room rose in accordance with protocol, but they all understood. This standing was not just a gesture of respect toward a high-ranking officer. It was an acknowledgement that America had crossed a line of the unacceptable, and that the black woman walking toward the witness table was living proof of it. Maya set her documents down, adjusted the microphone, and then lifted her gaze to the entire committee. Her eyes were calm, but behind that calm was a storm that had been held back for many years, many lifetimes. "Thank you, members of Congress, for allowing me to testify today." Her voice carried, low and clear enough that every person in the room fell silent. A service member never wants to be at the center of a civil rights investigation. But that night, I was not standing before a national defense bill or a foreign enemy. I was standing at a checkpoint on American soil, being treated like a criminal, not because of my conduct, but because of my skin color and the address where I live. Behind her, a lawmaker bowed his head and gripped his pen, as if her words had struck directly at what he had long avoided facing. Maya continued, her voice deepening. "I was ordered out of my car without cause. I was handcuffed so tightly that my wrists bled. I was mocked, insulted, and treated as a fraud when I presented my military credentials. Not one officer stopped to ask, am I violating her rights? No one thought of the Constitution. They saw a black woman from Eastwood Gardens, and for them, that was enough to condemn." The room fell silent, not with polite quiet, but with the heavy stillness of truth colliding with walls. A member of Congress asked, "General Johnson, what makes you believe this checkpoint program was a system of racial discrimination and not just misconduct by a few individuals?" Maya did not look at the person asking. She turned her gaze to the screen behind her, where the technical team had brought up the map of Brookdale. Red dots spread across it, glowing like unhealed wounds. "Because I've seen this pattern my entire life," Maya said. "I grew up in a neighborhood people called dangerous long before they ever set foot in it. I watched fathers pulled over because of the way they looked. Mothers are taking long detours to avoid checkpoints. Children are learning to lower their heads in front of police, instead of being taught that police exist to protect them." She paused, not to catch her breath, but to let every lawmaker feel the weight of what she'd just said. "And the most dangerous thing," she went on, "is when injustice no longer comes from a handful of bad officers, but is legitimized through policy documents, through budgets, through the signatures of people in power. That is not just abuse. That is policy." An older white congresswoman asked, her voice unsteady, "Can you summarize the Department of Defense's findings for us?" Maya opened her laptop. Slides appeared, data, videos, charts, evidence that could not be dismissed. But amid all the numbers, the thing that made the room hold its breath was a single video clip. Maya being shoved into a police car, her hands bleeding, her eyes still locked onto the camera. "If a four-star general, can be treated this way," Maya said, her tone no longer icy but softened with raw humanity, "then what do you think happens to those without a title, without stars on their shoulders, without a lawyer?" A younger lawmaker who had once been a civil rights attorney bowed his head low. The question needed no answer. The committee pressed on. Why did the Department of Defense feel it necessary to intervene in what appears to be a municipal issue? Maya replied, her voice steady but firm. "Because civil rights violations are no longer just a local issue. When citizens lose trust in law enforcement, national security is affected. A nation is only strong when its people feel protected, not hunted." Another lawmaker, gray-bearded, voice stern, asked, "In your view, what needs to change?" Maya looked straight at him. "Transparency," she said first. "No agency should be allowed to operate in the dark. Independent oversight. Disaggregated data by race and neighborhood must be public. Checkpoints must be based on evidence, not prejudice. And most importantly, when a program harms one community, it must be stopped before it takes a four-star general being arrested to trigger action." She lowered the microphone, then lifted it again, as if remembering what mattered most. "But change won't come from laws alone. It will come from the courage of people willing to tell the truth. Detective Ruiz—" Maya turned toward the back rows, where Ruiz sat, tried to fight from within a broken system, and many residents of Eastwood tried to cry out, but no one listened. "Today, I'm not here just to tell my story. I'm here to carry their voices with me." Applause rose from the gallery, not synchronized, not theatrical, but genuine and steady. Some lawmakers lifted their hands to wipe their eyes. The cameras panned from Maya's face to the faces of ordinary people sitting behind her, many of them from Eastwood Gardens, their eyes bright with a hope they hadn't felt in years. The committee chair concluded, "General Johnson, your testimony will play a central role in drafting the Federal Checkpoint Reform Act currently being prepared in Congress. We thank you for your service, not only on the battlefield, but also on the front lines of justice." Maya bowed her head, not out of ceremony, but because she knew this moment was not just for her. It was for every black man, woman, and child who had ever been forced to stand at the side of the road, scrutinized, and treated as dangerous simply for existing. As she stepped out of the hearing room, midday light flooded the halls of Congress. Maya closed her eyes for a second, took a deep breath, then opened them again. That day, something in America shifted, and she knew the fight was far from over. But for the first time, an entire nation was looking directly at the truth, and not looking away. Afternoons in Eastwood Gardens always carried a scent all their own. The damp bark after a brief rain, the drift of home-cooked meals weaving through narrow alleys, and the quiet spirit of a neighborhood that had survived too many anxious nights, yet still woke each day holding on to a fragile sliver of hope. Maya stood at the end of the street where she grew up, where childhood memories still lingered in the cracks of the sidewalk and in every old unpainted brick. There was no checkpoint at the street's entrance anymore. No more flickering blue-red lights through the night. No more shouting, no more confused faces behind windshields, wondering why they were being stopped again. This afternoon held only warm sunlight spilling through the trees, the sound of kids kicking a ball across the concrete courtyard, and the faint hum of old music drifting from Mrs. Loren's second-floor apartment, the same woman who used to scold Maya for climbing her fence to steal plums. Eastwood looked today the way it had long before it became the invisible battleground of prejudice. Maya walked slowly along the sidewalk, her hand brushing the peeling paint of the 4-story building where she'd grown up. The cold, rough bricks beneath her fingertips made her chest tighten. She remembered how her mother would grip her hand and rush her past each checkpoint, always whispering, "Don't look them in the eye, baby." Back then, Maya thought her mother was afraid. Now she knew her mother had been protecting her from a world that never intended to be fair. The wooden door at the entrance creaked open. An elderly woman, silver-haired, small-framed, but with eyes sharp as a blade, stepped onto the stoop. It was Louise, an old neighbor, the one who watched Maya on nights when her mother worked late shifts. "You really came home," she said, her voice trembling yet filled with warmth. "This whole neighborhood's been watching you on the news, but seeing you here, right here, is what makes it real." Maya stepped forward and embraced her. Louise's thin arms wrapped around her with an unexpected strength. In that embrace, Maya was suddenly the little girl who used to hide in Louise's kitchen whenever police sirens got too close. "You did what we've been waiting a whole lifetime for," Louise whispered. "That checkpoint, it was like a shadow pressing on all of us. The children were scared of walking to school. Grown folks were scared of going to work. And now the road is open again. Peaceful, like it used to be." Footsteps came rushing from behind. A little boy, maybe 9, with curly hair and a backpack slipping off one shoulder, skidded to a stop, out of breath. You're Miss Maya from TV, right?" he asked, eyes wide. "The one who made those cops get in trouble?" Maya knelt to meet his gaze. "I just did my part," she said softly. "The rest, that's for kids like you, to make sure you can walk to school without being scared you'll get stopped." The boy nodded hard. "They arrested my dad when I was 8. He didn't do anything. I remember everything. I was really scared. But now the checkpoint's gone. My dad said it's because of you." Maya felt her heart tighten, not from pain, but as if something inside her was cracking open to let the light in. After the boy ran off, Louise took Maya's hand and led her to the shared courtyard. A group of neighbors had gathered, some cooking, some chatting. But when they saw Maya, the conversations stopped. A young woman stepped forward first and hugged her tightly without asking permission. "Because of you, they cleared my son's record," she said through a shaky breath. "He got his scholarship back. He cried all night, so did I." A middle-aged man placed a hand on Maya's shoulder. "We see you as the hero of this neighborhood. No one's ever done this for us. No one ever dared." Another voice added, "It's not just about the checkpoints. You made us feel seen, heard, respected." Maya listened to every word, but inside her there was only one kind of emotion, the kind that warmed her chest, made her hands tremble slightly. and forced her to breathe deeply to keep the tears from rising. That night, the courtyard lights flicked on, food was passed around, laughter echoed, and the stories about the checkpoints were shared, not in fear, but in relief. For the first time, the nightmare belonged to the past. Maya stood a little apart, watching her neighborhood bathed in soft golden light. No sirens, no checkpoints, no suspicious stares from men in uniform. Just people, finally living the way they should have been allowed to live long ago. Free, peaceful, and without having to ask permission simply to exist. Her phone buzzed, a message from Ruiz. We did the right thing. Maya looked toward the road leading out of Eastwood, the road where darkness used to wait for them every night. She typed back, not just right, necessary. And beneath the night sky, draped over Eastwood Gardens like a blanket holding every memory close, Maya understood that this was only the beginning of a much larger journey, but also one of those rare moments when justice was not only heard but felt. 6 months later, Washington, D.C. wore the quiet stillness of winter settling in. The air was crisp, and the trees lining Constitution Avenue had begun to shed their leaves, exposing dark, slender branches that stretched upward against the gray sky. Inside the Department of Defense headquarters, warm yellow light spread across the marble floors, reflecting the blurred movements of military officers and civilian staff hurrying between back-to-back meetings. General Maya Johnson stood beside the tall glass wall on the 12th floor, looking down at the dark water of the Potomac. The past 6 months had felt like 6 years, strained, heavy, overflowing with data pouring in from cities across the country. But they had also carried something else. Hope. Hope written into policy, into reform, into change she once thought would take a decade or more. The conference room door opened. Colonel Jackson stepped inside, a thick folder under his arm, his boots striking the floor with weight. Latest report, Jackson said. 17 police departments have voluntarily restructured their checkpoint systems. None of them waited for federal intervention. Maya took the folder, flipping quickly through several pages. Maps from major cities, Chicago, Milwaukee, Charlotte, Austin, zoomed into view. The red clusters that once suffocated low-income neighborhoods had shifted or disappeared entirely. Good, she said. If even one city learns from Brookdale, thousands more won't suffer the same injustice. Jackson sat down, forearms resting on the table. Not just 17. DOJ has opened 9 additional civil rights investigations at the state level, all initiated after your report. Maya still didn't smile, but her eyes softened, deeper, warmer. This wasn't a victory to flaunt. It was a victory made of small, overlooked lives, people who had been reduced to shadows on the side of the road. A soft knock tapped at the door. Lieutenant Jasmine Williams, who had first reported checkpoint irregularities at Maxwell Air Force Base, stepped in. Her uniform was sharp, posture straight, eyes bright, though her expression still carried the cautiousness of someone who had once felt the system turn its weight against her. "Come in, Lieutenant," Maya said, her tone noticeably gentler. "Your report was one of the critical pieces." Williams placed a file on the table, voice steady but modest. "Ma'am, since the new monitoring system was implemented, every checkpoint around Maxwell has to upload data hourly. We identified 3 with racial discrepancies. 2 were shut down this morning." "Are you all right?" Maya asked. Not as a general, but as someone who knew exactly what it felt like to be scrutinized for the color of her skin. Williams hesitated, then nodded. "Much better, ma'am. Not just on base. In the city, too. People are starting to believe that if they speak up, someone will listen." Maya watched her, seeing in the young officer a faint reflection of herself decades earlier. When she had been younger, she'd wanted to shout to the world, "We are not a threat! We just want to live like everyone else!" No one had listened back then. Now, those voices were echoing from thousands, recorded, logged, analyzed, and answered. After Williams left the room, Maya turned back toward the large screen displaying a national map marked with civil rights risk indicators. Each point represented an untold story, a painful memory, a person who had been stopped because their car was too old, or because they passed through the wrong neighborhood at the wrong time. "Strange, isn't it, Colonel?" Maya said quietly, her voice drifting toward the glass. "We can track enemies across oceans with satellites, but we let abuses under our own roofs fester for years." Jackson nodded, his usually stoic face revealing a rare flicker of sorrow. "Sometimes the hardest enemy to confront is the silence of the system we trust." Maya thought of the men at Brookdale Station. Wilson's stunned eyes when he heard the word general. Harris's trembling hands when asked about the blood on her wrists. Clark's confident smile was crumbling into panic beneath the weight of recorded truth. But she also thought of Ruiz, the only one in that building who realized the truth too late, yet still chose to step toward the light when it mattered. Her phone buzzed, a message from Morales. "Bennett got 5 years. Sentence confirmed this morning. Compensation claims for victims have begun. My brother got his professional license reinstated." Maya closed her eyes for a moment. No cheering, no triumph, just a deep release, so profound it softened her entire chest. Justice never made anyone whole, but it helped people breathe again. "General," Jackson said, "in the past half-year we've accomplished something I once thought impossible, a nationwide checkpoint oversight program. A civil rights escalation system directly tied to the Department of Defense, the strongest federal cooperation since the 60s. You've created a model law schools will teach." "Not me," Maya said, shaking her head gently. "The people harmed long before me. They didn't have stars on their shoulders, but they had a reason to fight. I just did what they always hoped someone would do." She walked toward the glass wall again. Below, the Capitol continued its daily rhythm. Sirens, footsteps, wind. But threaded within the noise, Maya sensed something new. Trust slowly returning. Fragile, but real. A general might win 1,000 battles abroad. But Maya's greatest battle had not been fought on foreign soil. It had been fought on the streets she knew best, where cold metal cuffs had once torn her skin and forced America to look at its own reflection. And 6 months later, she knew one thing with certainty. This fight would not end in Brookdale. It had spread, and would keep spreading, until no checkpoint anywhere was built on bias, until no child learned to fear the police before learning to trust them. Maya set her hand on the map, her voice low but powerful. "Let's keep going." Dawn settled over America in a soft light that few people noticed on days too busy for them to look up. General Maya Johnson stood alone on the balcony of the Pentagon, watching the distant city wake. From that vantage point, everything seemed smaller. Small buildings, small cars, small hurried people. But what they had endured for so many years was not small. The fear was not small. The losses were not small. The tears shed in silence were not small. Maya released a slow breath. No more handcuffs biting into her skin. No more shouting in an interrogation room. No more suspicious glances each time she drove across the line between two neighborhoods. But in her memory, everything was still intact. And she knew those memories did not belong to her alone. They belonged to millions. She thought of the boy clutching a teddy bear in the checkpoint video. She thought of the mother who burst into tears when she said her son's record had been cleared. She thought of Ruiz, the man who decided to stand on the right side at the hardest moment. And she thought of all the people who were never named, never shown on the news, never acknowledged. Yet their pain was the reason everything that happened afterward was possible. A light wind blew, making the flag on the highest pole snap sharply in the air. Maya looked at it, the colors vivid under the new sunlight. "That is the America I believe in," she whispered. Not the America of racially biased checkpoints, not the America of distorted numbers, not the America of political smiles hiding abuses of power, but the America of people who rise up, who speak out, who look directly at the truth, even when that truth hurts so badly it takes the breath from your lungs. That is a real strength. If one night in Brookdale could ignite a nationwide investigation, how many other shadows were waiting to be illuminated? Maya turned toward the door, ready to step into another day of work she had never imagined she would carry, yet now knew was the reason she existed. "Justice doesn't happen on its own," she said, her voice firm as steel. "It needs someone to lead the way." And then, before stepping inside, Maya looked straight into the camera recording that morning's press briefing, her eyes powerful, steady, and full of love for those listening. If this story makes you feel pain, stay. If it gives you hope, speak up. And if you want to continue the journey of exposing the truth, subscribe to Racist Reality right now. Because fighting for justice is never the journey of one person. It belongs to all of us. The first light of the day shone on Maya's face, sparkling like a promise. One chapter closes, but the journey has only just begun. In the end, the truth always finds a way to step into the light, even when blocked by power, even when buried under mocking laughter, even when strangled by blood-tightened handcuffs. Justice still rises because of the people who refuse to stay silent. And if General Maya Johnson's story reached you, if it made you angry, hurt, or simply made your heart tighten under the weight of so much injustice in this country, then remember this. What you just watched is only one among countless stories America is still trying to hide in the dark. But darkness cannot win forever. At Racist Reality, every video is not just a story. It is a piece of truth. It is the voice of the forgotten. It is a reminder that justice belongs to no one alone, but everyone must help protect it. If you want to continue this journey, if you want to uncover the cases no one dares to talk about, the secrets buried away, the pain that needs to be named, and the moments when justice erupts like fire in the dead of night, subscribe to Racist Reality right now. And don't leave just yet. This channel holds many more stories waiting for you. Tense confrontations, distorted truths, and the strength of ordinary people whose courage outmatches any storm. If this video made you think, watch the next one. If it made you feel the need to act, share it. And if it made you believe that justice still has hope, stay with us. Thank you for watching until the end. Thank you for listening. Thank you for believing in the truth. See you in the next video, where another truth is waiting to be brought into the light.